This way, the sacred duel rules would conflict with the Swordmaster's code. Fred was stunned for a moment. After saying this, Joseph got up to leave. That afternoon, Alicia complained in her room, "Damn, Henry actually snuck away. How annoying." Duncan replied, "Endre no longer poses a threat to the family. The main thing now is to completely control Derma." While speaking, Alicia seemed to notice something. She asked Duncan, "Don't knights usually ride horses?" Duncan was stunned for a moment, then said, "Of course you can't be called a knight if you can't ride a horse." Alicia said, "Then it's true that when God opens one door, he closes another." It turned out that downstairs Fred was struggling to practice horse riding, but the horse didn't want to give Fred any face and directly shook Fred off. Seeing the situation, Jorger asked, "Didn't you say you could ride expensive horses?" Fred was also puzzled, saying, "Maybe I need even more expensive horse." After saying this, he was punched in the head by Jorger. Then he realized things seemed quite serious, saying, "I need to find the reason." Then Jorger told Fred not to practice today, saying he had to handle some matters. Then he turned and left. Fred could only sigh helplessly. Then he looked toward the giant tree nearby and decided to go see it once more. Sometime later, Fred came under the giant tree with his sword. Then he thrust the sword into the ground. The sword soul also successfully possessed him. As soon as he looked up, he saw the white snake appear before him. This scared Fred so much he almost let go of his sword. Then the white snake circled around Fred and even smiled at the end. The sword soul explained, "Don't try to understand spirits. After all, they're on another side of the world." At this time, the white snake howled toward the sky. Light also emanated from the surroundings. Fred only felt a warmth in his body, like being held by his mother. The sword soul was also incredulous, saying this was the spirit's blessing. The next day, Joseph and his group were also preparing to return. Alicia first thanked Joseph for his help, then told Fred to step forward. Fred was stunned for a moment. With both their consent, he walked forward. Then, seeing Fred kneel down, Alicia began to say, "I sincerely thank you, Fred. If it weren't for you, there would be no me today. So, I decide to entrust my name to you. Although you're not a knight, you were more glorious than a knight that day." Fred looked at the handkerchief before him, not knowing whether to accept it. But he remembered being scolded by Jorger before simply because he didn't accept Ruta's peanuts. Thinking of this, he accepted the handkerchief with both hands. Everyone was shocked. Joseph and the other also remembered that Fred hadn't received education about the noble world. Duncan nearby quickly said, "You can't accept it like that. Usually when a woman offers a handkerchief, it symbolizes two meanings. First is to hang it on the sword hilt, symbolizing honor. The second symbolizes love." After hearing this, Alicia's cheeks turned red. Fred looked completely confused. He looked around at everyone. The atmosphere seemed wrong. He quickly mumbled something and prepared to retreat. Back in the carriage, Joseph explained the reason and congratulated Fred on becoming a quasi-knight. Fred was obviously shocked. The knighthood he had struggled so hard to achieve was now accomplished just by accepting a handkerchief. Joseph continued explaining, "It's just enjoying a knight's treatment and only limited to that place in Derma." Fred seemed to understand. No wonder it was called quasi-knight. Just then, Fred alertly sensed something approaching. Sure enough, a group of people in black cloaks were attacking the convoy. Fred was about to draw his sword. Joseph beside him pressed down on him, said, "This is what I prepared before the duel began." The black-clothed men came before the convoy and all knelt on one knee to show respect. The leader held a bag of blood and said, "Lord Joseph, the mission is complete." Joseph looked at the blood bag, his face turned cold, then told the man to stand up. After standing up, the man glanced at Fred with his peripheral vision. Fred felt his hair stand on end as he was stared at, as if a python was eyeing its prey. After standing up, the man didn't linger much longer, showed respect to Joseph once again, then prepared to leave. Joseph noticed Fred's emotions at this moment. Joseph spoke indifferently. That blood-stained black bag contains the noble's world, a world of ruthlessness, cruelty, and merciless people. The scene shifted, and at this moment all the servants in the dining hall were discussing Fred's awakening of the aura. Everyone was incredulous, especially Sauvening and his followers. At this time, the door opened. Fred slowly walked into the dining hall. The crowd that had just been chattering suddenly fell silent because they knew that Fred was no longer the same person as before. Fred felt quite helpless at this moment. Now, he couldn't even eat properly because many people were secretly watching him. This big star. Portley also expressed there was nothing he could do about it, estimating the situation would continue for another 2 days. Then, Portley suddenly mentioned the servant's vacation and suggested whether Fred wanted to go home with him. Fred thought about it. He seemed to have nowhere else to go. Seeing Fred still hesitating, Portley hurriedly offered unlimited roasted meat, and Fred was slightly tempted. Portley continued, "There are also horses. Haven't you been looking for horses recently? I heard another horse just arrived, and apparently there are several that are even better than the Jaeger Knight's horses." Upon hearing this, Fred's eyes lit up, and he immediately expressed that he would definitely go. Sometime later in the training ground, Fred was sparring with Jorger. At this time, Fred wanted to try the aura he had released before. Jorger saw through his intentions and told Fred to focus. Fred didn't listen to the advice. Seeing the situation, Jorger instantly became angry and directly struck Fred's back with his sword. Fred cried out in pain and knelt on the ground. Jorger looked at Fred seriously and said, "Do you think you're impressive just because you fought against a knight? You won't even listen to what I say now." Fred was about to explain something but was scared off by Jorger's glare. Fred hurriedly stood up and apologized. Jorger didn't want to say much more, turned and said, "That's enough for today." Fred could only helplessly turn and leave. At this moment, Jorger was very worried about Fred's state of mind because this seemed somewhat dangerous. That night, Fred didn't choose to rest, but worked even harder to hone his swordsmanship. On the distant wall, Jorger followed because he was still worried. He breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Fortunately, Fred didn't give up because of this." The next day, Fred looked at the two men with disbelief. It turned out that Joseph had suggested giving Fred a vacation. Fred still wanted to say something but was directly interrupted by Joseph. So Fred said no more. His eyes kept secretly glancing at Jorger beside him. Jorger ignored him, so they fell into brief silence. At this time, Jorger spoke, "Even during vacation, you can't put down your sword for a moment. I hope when you return next time, you'll be in a different state." Hearing this, Fred knew Jorger had forgiven him and showed a happy expression. After a few brief words, they let Fred leave. Fred had just walked out the door when he unexpectedly encountered Oksana's maid on the way, so he was brought here and put on a brand new black cloak. Seeing this, Oksana immediately praised Fred as a walking clothes hanger. Fred looked at Oksana's gentle and virtuous expression and couldn't hold himself together anymore, blush spreading across his entire face. At this time, Oksana said, "After this vacation ends, I'll find you a tutor. After all, mistakes like catching a lady's reputation with your hands should only happen once." Fred felt somewhat guilty after hearing this and readily agreed. After their conversation, Fred bowed again to express his gratitude and then turned to leave. On the other side, in the church, a group of nuns were discussing Fred's recent deeds, while Mina knelt cleaning the floor. Hearing about the blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy, Mina was stunned for a moment. How she hoped it was Fred. But thinking about it, Fred couldn't possibly have become so powerful so quickly. While she was lost in thought, 3 nuns discovered Mina slacking off and loudly scolded her. It turned out that, after they escaped that night, Marcella brought them to the church for refuge. Initially, the bishop disagreed, but Marcella had donated a lot of money to the church. Out of sentiment, the bishop could only agree to let the children in, but Marcella wasn't allowed to enter. Just then, the one-armed Jack's subordinate caught up. He grabbed Marcella in one swift motion and then dragged her away. This was the beginning of the nightmare. The next day, Fred and Portley arrived at the Connor estate. The butler and servants hurried out to greet them. Upon seeing the butler, Portley rushed forward and hugged him. It seemed the two had a very good relationship. Fortunately, the butler reacted in time and quickly apologized to Fred, who said it was fine. Then, they prepared to go to the pasture first to see what good horses were available. But as soon as the horses saw Fred, they all fled as if they had seen some monster. Even the cattle and sheep fled together. Fred was greatly disappointed. He had thought only horses couldn't be ridden, but it turned out even cattle couldn't be ridden. Seeing this situation, Portley quickly told Fred there were other horses and there would always be compatible ones. Fred could only hold on to his last bit of hope. Later, as evening came, the estate was working at full capacity, roasting various meats. Fred was also shocked, speechless. At this time, a middle-aged man came forward to greet them. "Welcome. Welcome. I'm the head of the household, Olsen." Hearing he was the household head, Fred politely greeted him. Seeing this rising star, Olsen was also generous, telling Fred to eat as much as he wanted. After saying this, he led Fred and the others to the living room. As soon as he pushed open the door, Fred was stunned. He never expected Rucker to appear here. Both immediately bowed in greeting. After seeing it was Fred, Rucker said sarcastically, "I wonder if you're still willing to dine with me today." Fred was speechless. He hadn't expected Ruta to be so vindictive. Fred wanted to refuse, but seeing the gazes of the surrounding knights, he could only reluctantly agree, as it was better not to offend a group of knights. The next day, Ruta's group walked along the road. At this moment, Fred was sulking because his vacation time had been commandeered by Ruta to serve his labor. Dorothea beside him looked displeased. She said, "What are you looking at? Haven't you seen a beastman before? Can you really use a aura? Why can't you ride horses?" Faced with several questions in a row, Fred only replied with 10 words. "In life, anything is possible." Unexpectedly, Dorothy continued asking questions, and Fred became somewhat annoyed. Fortunately, Rucker interrupted in time, and Dorothea had to give up. At this time, a knight pointed to a group of people walking in the distance. They were pilgrims. Then he had his subordinates raised the banner to show their intentions. Fred also understood the purpose of this trip. Hunting was just a pretense. The real purpose was to protect those pilgrims. Suddenly, smoke exploded in the distance as if something was approaching. Looking carefully, it was a herd of wild horses, but for some reason, they were running south. Immediately after, Fred's heart suddenly jumped, as if something bad was about to happen. Rucker also sensed something, and his expression became serious. Just then, the ground began to shake violently. Fred was the first to react. This wasn't an earthquake. It was the tremor from a deathworm's movement. Then, they saw the deathworm bite a fleeing horse in one gulp. Dorothy was surprised for a moment because deathworms don't eat meat. But this deathworm was strange, as if it was being controlled by someone. After eating the wild horse, the deathworm turned its gaze toward the distant pilgrims. Seeing the situation, Ruta immediately asked Dorothea what deathworms react to. Dorothea said blankly only to vibrations. Seeing Dorothea was somewhat panicked, Rucker shouted loudly, telling Dorothea to wake up. Then he ordered Fred to protect Dorothea well, as he was going to attract the Deathworm's attention. Fred received the order and immediately responded. Understood. Then Ruta led everyone to charge quickly toward the Deathworm. Facing this level of monster, Rucker directly deployed his aura and launched a fierce attack on the Deathworm. But the Deathworm had the title of Dragon's Remnant. How could it be defeated so easily? When the smoke cleared, the Deathworm hadn't suffered any damage at all. Then the Deathworm bit toward Rucker's direction. Fortunately, Rucker reacted in time and hurriedly dodged the attack, but the Deathworm seized the opportunity and burrowed underground, then quickly drilled toward the pilgrims. Seeing the situation, Fred turned and told Dorothea to speed up, but unexpectedly, Dorothea was drawing something with her tail. Dorothea hurriedly explained, "This is a ritual of our Beastmen tribe." Then the talisman began to emit light. Fred didn't waste words and directly snatched the talisman, then turned and jumped off the cliff. The first half went smoothly, but his coolness lasted less than 3 seconds as Fred's foot slipped and he rolled straight down, then crashed heavily to the ground. The two people on the mountaintop looked at Fred lying on the ground in shock, but Fred was completely unharmed, and even he couldn't quite believe it. While surprised, Fred's body began to emit dazzling light. The lead black horse beside him seemed to sense something. It turned to look in Fred's direction. An extremely gentle aura attracted its attention. It was the blessing of the spirits. But now wasn't the time to think about these things. The urgent matter was to deal with the Deathworm. At this time, Fred's gaze swept over, and he actually saw Priest Andre. His heart immediately panicked, turning to look at Rucker's position. The distance was too far. The Deathworm would definitely arrive first. At this moment, Fred looked at the talisman in his hand. After hesitating for a moment, he still decided to use the talisman himself to attract the Deathworm's attention. Then, the magic circle was activated, and Fred's sword was also imbued with vibration magic. Then Fred thrust forcefully and the ground began to shake, but this vibration wasn't enough. He had to release his aura. Fred suddenly opened his eyes wide, and at the same time the surroundings emitted incredibly dazzling light. The Deathworm was immediately attracted and rushed quickly toward Fred. The Deathworm launched the first attack. Fortunately, Fred retreated and dodged the attack. The sword soul within him told him not to be too eager to fight, as this guy wasn't something ordinary people could handle yet. Fred naturally knew this too, but the Deathworm's attacks were too fierce and Fred was somewhat overwhelmed. Just as Fred was thinking about how to deal with it, the Deathworm directly burrowed underground. It completely disappeared from Fred's sight. When he realized what was happening, it was already too late. The Deathworm burst directly from beneath his feet. Rucker was shocked. He stared blankly at the scene before him. But the next second, a figure burst from the smoke. It was the black horse that had saved him. The sword soul told him to look again with his aura. Unexpectedly, a silver horn had appeared on the horse's forehead. At this time, Ruta caught up and asked if Fred was injured. Fred said he was fine. Hearing that Fred was okay, Ruta then explained the tactics. "You go lure the Deathworm over. Leave the rest to me." Looking at Rucker's determined eyes, Fred reluctantly accepted and then charged forward quickly. Seeing the Deathworm was chasing him, Fred felt relieved and had the black horse accelerate to dodge attacks, while he continued to attract the Deathworm's attention with his aura's amplification. Arriving at the designated position, Rutger told the others to scatter. He himself closed his eyes and gathered power in his sword. Fred was stunned seeing this, and the sword soul explained, "He temporarily expanded his own world. Only knights who can deeply examine themselves can use this." Ruta truly was an extraordinary knight, beyond imagination. The Deathworm seemed to sense something and immediately stopped its moving body. Fred was obviously panicked for a moment. Indeed, his own world was still too weak. Suddenly, the black horse's forehead emitted dazzling light, and then Fred felt his abilities improving. The aura he emitted once again attracted the Deathworm's attention. But at this moment, Fred had reached his limit. Fortunately, Rucker's knights charged up together and activated their auras, which continued to attract the Deathworm's attention. At this time, Rucker was ready to strike. Just as Fred and the others passed by him, Rucker's eyes focused and a terrifying aura emanated from his entire body. Then he struck with all his might. The Deathworm instantly turned to ash. Fred stepped forward to inquire about Rucker's injuries. Rucker said he was fine, then struggled to stand up, but his legs were somewhat weak and he fell on his bottom. At this time, Rucker wanted Fred to help him up, but Fred also sat down on his bottom. Rucker looked awkwardly at his hands suspended in midair, and then sighed helplessly. At this time, the knights nearby also came over to praise Fred for doing well. Fred said, "Thank you," embarrassedly. Then Priest Andre's voice came from nearby. Fred immediately stood up and bowed. Andre also gave Fred the highest blessing. Seeing the scene, the pilgrims behind also knelt down and prayed together. Time came to evening and several people rested and recovered on the spot. At this moment, Fred was frowning as he wiped his sword. Rucker walked over slowly with a bottle of wine, then sat down and asked Fred if he wanted a sip. Fred was about to refuse, but Rucker directly interrupted. "Now that I think about it, you've refused me 3 times already. Did Joseph tell you to stay away from me?" After hearing this, Fred reluctantly took the wine bottle and drank it all in one gulp. Rucker saw Fred's battle-scarred sword and then asked why he didn't have someone repair it. Fred was also helpless. Other blacksmiths couldn't fix it. Only by finding its owner could it be done. Rucker didn't think much about it. After taking a sip of wine, he asked Fred where he planned to look for the sword's owner. Fred's eyes focused. Then he said, "Dia." At this time on the other side in Oksana's mansion, Oksana was embroidering the Hinar family crest. The maid praised how well Lady Oksana was doing. Oksana said this was her first time doing it. She had seen her mother do it before, but these traditions had been gradually forgotten. After all, those knights living in luxury had no right to take up their banners. The next day, several people began their journey home. The black horse nearby also ran to bid farewell to the convoy. Although Fred was somewhat reluctant, the black horse had to protect its own tribe and he had things to do. Andre saw Fred's reluctance and comforted him. "You don't need to be too reluctant. Life is composed of joys and sorrows. When fate arrives, you will naturally reunite." After hearing this, Fred also relaxed a little. At this time in the Earl's mansion, the Earl was frowning and pondering something. It turned out that just now news came from the west that Earl Rufnoma had fallen, but there was no news from the royal side. These new rulers seemed to be attempting to break the old feudal society. On the other side, Fred was hesitating whether to knock and report. After all, he had helped Ruta. Given Jorga's personality, he would definitely get a beating. But this was just his imagination, so he knocked on the door. They chatted briefly. The situation didn't seem that bad, but looking up, he found 2 people staring at him intently. Although they were angry, he was their servant after all. Then Joseph stood up and came to a banner saying, "This is a banner symbolizing one's own honor. You now have the right to take up the banner that belongs only to you. Go take this back to your homeland. Hinar and Biode will support you. Go personally deal with the filthy existence that binds you." At this moment, Fred could no longer express his emotions in words. Was it joy, relief, or emotion? He only knew that he finally had the right to judge those bastards. As soon as Fred received his banner, he could no longer contain himself and set off for Dia that very night. In the evening, in the Dia dance hall, a group of men surrounded a room. and inside the room, a woman was dressing and applying makeup. This person was Marcella. It turned out that after being caught that day, she was sold to the dance hall for the men outside to play with. An old woman nearby was urging Marcella to hurry up and go out. Marcella said nothing, just continued applying light makeup. Seeing the situation, the old woman directly lifted Marcella's chin and said, "There's still a long time ahead until you're old and ugly. You won't be able to leave here." Marcella just smiled faintly, then glared fiercely at the old woman. The old woman was also startled, thinking, "I didn't expect her to still be defiant after being treated like this." Then Marcella put down her makeup tools and stood up to leave the room. At this moment, Marcella had already decided to end it all tonight. After all, Sanji was dead, and seeing that the others were all living well, she could die without regrets. The men outside all cheered loudly when they saw Marcella come out. The old woman said, "Those who want to spend the night with Dia's Black Rose, please bid your prices." Everyone immediately began competing. The old woman had to admire Marcella. Despite being middle-aged, she still had such charm. At this time, someone in the crowd shouted, 4 gold coins. The old woman felt this price was about right and was about to announce the result. Just then, a voice suddenly came from outside the door. 100 gold coins. Everyone was startled. The old woman was also stunned. Then, a figure entered the dance hall. Hearing this voice, Marcella became somewhat panicked because this voice sounded too much like that man's voice, the man who had caused their organization's destruction. Then Fred said as he walked, "Also, bring me a serving of roasted sausage and black pudding, plus potato cakes and white bread." After hearing this, Marcella was surprised because these were things Sanji liked to eat. Then a golden light flashed before her eyes. That's right, Fred had returned. Looking at the man who had grown up before her, Marcella was already in tears, but reality rang alarm bells for her. So, she hurriedly told Fred to run away, because Jack's subordinates were watching here. The old woman saw the two whispering and guessed what was happening. Then she asked Jack's subordinates to deal with him. Several people understood and stood up to take action. Fred was completely unperturbed. He said, "Before paying, I happen to have a debt to settle with you all." Seeing the old woman was confused, Fred directly emanated a cold aura and said, "Jack owes me a debt." The leading man was about to draw his sword when Fred instantly appeared and slid his throat. Almost no one could react what had happened because it was too fast. The others saw the situation and drew their swords, demanding to know who Fred was. Fred raised his short sword and said, "I am Sanji's last short sword." Hearing this, one subordinate finally realized and said, "He's Fred." Fred replied, "I am Fred. Come on, kill me." Just like that day, everyone shuddered because the aura of Fred before them was too much, like a bloodthirsty wolf. Seeing the men weren't moving, Fred struck first. With one stab, the man couldn't react in time. Then he went on a killing spree among the crowd, one scream after another. They fell one by one until their blood paid for every tear Marcella had shed. On the other side, in Jack's organization, Jack was lying exhausted in his chair. He reflected on his life's experiences. Now that Sanji was dead, he had become the leader of the entire back alley. If he wanted to climb higher, he had to plunder others' things, stepping on enemies' corpses to climb higher. But, now that he had climbed to the peak, he realized such fate was merely decided by the upper class's single word: this damned life. Just then, a subordinate burst through the door and exclaimed, "Boss, we're surrounded by the guard." Hearing this, Jack could only smile helplessly. This day had finally come. On the other side, Baldin had the mayor and guards surround the entire back alley. Looking at the mayor's fawning appearance, he guessed that the mayor's turning a blind eye to the back alley's affairs was all due to receiving high tribute payments. Baldin could only sigh. This mayor probably wouldn't last much longer either. At this time, the mayor asked when the knight from the guild would come. Balden turned to look behind and said, "He's already here." Then they saw Fred walking out from afar, covered in blood. Seeing Fred wanted to go alone, Balden couldn't help but worry, as he would be in trouble if Fred got hurt. But looking at Fred's determined eyes, Balden could only sigh helplessly. Then he handed the banner to Fred. Fred planted the banner to the ground and the two family crests were revealed. Everyone was stunned. They hadn't seen banners for a very long time. Then Balden began to pronounce Jack's crimes. After the pronouncement, he let Fred do as he pleased. Fred didn't hesitate at all. He drew his long sword and began releasing the power of his aura, recalling his unwilling past. Fred's eyes became increasingly resolute. Then he struck down with his sword. The door shattered with a crash. The people behind the door were directly blown away. Fred also walked in immediately. It was time to cut these evil ties. Fred said slowly, "I am Fred of Dia. I am not only a rightful agent, but also a rightful avenger." Hearing this familiar voice, Jack slowly stood up and couldn't stop laughing. Seeing only Fred charging alone, everyone raised their swords to strike. But Fred was a knight. He instantly dealt with these small fry before him. The others were all scared, but since Fred was just one person, they naively thought they could surround him. But Fred immediately activated his aura. In just an instant, everyone had white marks on their bodies. Then, within the circular range centered on Fred, everyone suffered varying degrees of casualties. Seeing such power, everyone decided to tear down the stairs so Fred couldn't come up. Fred was also slightly troubled, but this was the Black Rose Tavern where he had lived since childhood. How could he not be familiar with it? Then he cut the rope with one sword stroke, used the rope's momentum to fly up and reach the top floor. Then came endless slaughter. Faced with this demon-like man, they were afraid. Completely afraid. Seeing no one dared to step forward, Fred took the initiative to attack. Wherever he went, none survived. Even the sword soul within praised him as a natural-born killer. After killing the last person, Fred looked back, although he hadn't recreated that day's scene. It was enough. It was time to finish this. So, he leisurely walked up the stairs, and then opened the door. Jack had been waiting for a long time. Jack didn't speak, but placed a cup of wine beside him. Then sighed helplessly and said, "Although I'd heard the rumors, I still didn't dare believe it." After saying this, he stood up, drew his sword, and prepared, saying, "Let me put a perfect end to your world." Seeing this situation, Fred also drew his sword to meet the enemy. A great battle was about to break out, but Jack, having fought his way to this position, definitely had strength. He actually blocked Fred's attack and pushed Fred back. Compared to strength, Fred was better at agility and technique. After just a few rounds, Fred successfully suppressed Jack, but Jack wasn't one to give up easily. He gritted his teeth and pushed hard again, pushing Fred back. Then came continuous strikes. Fred was also stunned. At this time, Jack also fell into memories. He once had dreams too, dreams of claiming that light as his own. He wanted to grasp that brilliance, so he worked hard to climb upward. Even though there was a mountain of corpses and sea of fire beneath his feet, but he finally climbed to the peak of the back alley. But why still couldn't he touch that light, even if it was built with blood? Thinking of this, a twinkling star appeared before his eyes. That was Fred holding the sword. Seeing the glowing Fred, Jack finally understood. To touch the light, one must have the qualification to shine. Looking at Fred glowing before him, Jack laughed loudly. Excellent. Sanji would be very happy to see this. Hearing Sanji's name, Fred could no longer hold back. He shouted and struck with his sword. Jack had also come to terms with it. He said, "Today is a good day. I'm going to open all the wine barrels in the back alley and hold a feast. You'll climb even higher in the future." With that, their attacks repelled each other again. But the next second, Fred instantly adjusted his posture and thrust with his sword. Jack was pierced, and his life began flashing before his eyes. This was fine, too. Rather than being crushed by a powerful world, it was better to be a stepping stone for a capable young man. Looking at Jack, who was about to die, Fred asked if he had any last words. Jack placed his iron hand on Fred's head and then said, "You've worked hard. Rest a while before you go." Fred was puzzled why Jack showed such an expression. Then he pulled out his long sword. Jack swayed and covered his wound. Although he had done countless evil deeds in his life, at least he had lived brilliantly. Then Jack raised his iron hand and shouted, "I've had a very fulfilling life, Sanji. I'm coming." With that, he fell backward and dropped from the high building with a smile. Fred, having completed his revenge, felt no joy at all, but rather a faint bitterness. So he turned to look at the cup of wine still on the table, then picked up the wine and drank it all. After drinking, he left a gold coin and turned to leave, walking through this building full of corpses. Seeing the situation, ripples were stirred in the young man's world. After resolving everything, Fred slowly walked out of the building. His heart was mixed with emotions, and his eyes showed no light at all. Bulan and the guards behind him were all frightened by this terrifying presence. He felt that Fred before him wasn't a person, but an unreachable mountain peak. But Fred didn't care about their opinions. Just as he turned to leave, a voice came from afar. "Fred, I'm Haven." Hearing this familiar voice again, Fred suddenly came to his senses. He looked at the person before him with disbelief. He had thought all the family members of Sanji's organization had been wiped out, never expecting Haven to still be alive. At this moment, hope seemed to return to the young man's eyes. He was about to say something, but his body had reached its limit, and he fainted in Haven's arms. The next day, Fred looked down at the vast back alley, feeling somewhat uncomfortable as he had originally been just one of them. But it didn't matter now. The urgent matter was to find Bolden to discuss what came next. A few minutes later, he saw the haggarded-looking Bolden. But this wasn't his fault, as there were simply too many documents to process. So, Bolden was ready to assign Fred some tasks. Fred was stunned for a moment, then said, "I can't read documents and such." Bulon knew this, of course. So the task he gave Fred was captain of the guard, that is, arrest authority. Lord Joseph wanted to take this opportunity to reorganize the back alley. Fred readily agreed, as it was Lord Joseph's order. But before that, Fred had one more thing to do. Go to the prison to find someone, even if he had to turn the entire back alley upside down to find him. That morning, Fred hurried to the prison. After greeting the guards, he walked straight in and stopped at an iron cage. Everyone was scared away by this terrifying presence. Fred ignored them and silently searched for something. Soon he saw a person hiding in the corner. This was who had deliberately let him escape years ago. Fred had come to rescue him. At midday at the church, Fred slowly got down from the carriage. His purpose here was singular, to take away his family member, Mina. But at this moment, Mina was being bullied by the nuns, who demanded that if she didn't finish washing the dishes, she couldn't participate in prayer. So Fred looked for a long time without finding her. But, to avoid affecting progress, Fred still began praying first. Just then, familiar footsteps came from afar. Fred smiled slightly and stood up to look back. But the next second, Fred immediately frowned. How had she become so thin? This scene happened to be seen by a nun, who hurriedly asked what was happening. Fred chose to ignore her and walked directly toward Mina. Mina looked at the familiar yet strange man before her, feeling emotional, even thinking this wasn't Fred. Only when Fred called her name did she realize Fred looked at Mina's dirty clothes and calloused fingers. His heart filled with anger, saying, "Damn it, acting like a fool, what are you doing?" With that, he crouched down to help her clean her clothes. Mina was incredulous, her body slightly trembling. After confirming it was Fred, she couldn't hold back anymore. Tears just fell straight down. All the grievances of these years were released today. Seeing the situation, Fred immediately hugged Mina tightly. He had originally wanted to thank the church for their care over the years. But seeing Mina like this, Fred didn't plan to give them a good face. Thus, the three people who were homeless that night finally had a new home. Then they took the carriage home. That night, the blacksmith was recalling his life's experiences. He used only 4 words to describe his current situation, accomplished nothing. Seeing it was getting late, the blacksmith prepared to close and rest. Just as he was about to close, a voice came from behind. "Boss, closing so early. My sword is waiting to be repaired." Hearing this, the blacksmith was stunned, then turned around. Sure enough, it was that little brat from years ago, now returned in glory. The blacksmith excitedly said, "Of course I can fix it." Then the blacksmith took the weathered honor sword and asked about the origin of the scars on the sword. Fred described them one by one. There were goblins and deathworms too. The blacksmith was filled with relief after hearing this and decided to use the rest of his life to perfect this honor sword with all his might. The next day, Fred found Haven, wanting him to help with something. That was to search for clues about Jack's hidden assets. Haven pondered for a moment, then slowly said, "Perhaps it's related to the courtesans who were sold." Upon hearing this, Fred immediately said, "That's a bit tricky." I searched around briefly, but several people disappeared without a trace. I know one of them was called Anna. Haven said puzzledly, "That's very strange. Logically speaking, a living person couldn't disappear so completely." While Haven was thinking, Otter interrupted the two who were discussing from a distance. He said, "Fred, as you said, I went around and finally found a suspicious place." Hearing there was news, Fred immediately got up, ready to go to the scene to investigate. After some time, Fred arrived at that suspicious place. It was a butcher shop. As soon as he arrived, Fred handed a piece of paper to the boss with the missing person's name written on it. The boss said, "I don't know him. If you want to ask, go ask Black Bear." Fred smiled faintly and said, "Of course I'll go ask. But how do you know what's written on the paper is a person's name? People in the back alley basically can't read. It seems you're an outsider who doesn't understand the situation here. What you're selling isn't pork, but human flesh, right?" After hearing this, the boss froze in place for 3 seconds. Then he immediately swung his knife at Fred. Seeing this, Fred wasn't panicked at all and directly pulled out his dagger. A few minutes later, the boss was beaten down, and he confessed everything he knew. Seeing he had confessed everything, Fred didn't make things difficult for him anymore. Later, he organized the information with Otter. First was the butcher, Black Bear, who is now a major figure in the back alley. Second was the slave trader. Just then, Otter's brother came running hurriedly, saying he had found clues. He said someone saw Anna getting into a carriage. And what was particularly strange was that all those getting into the carriage were pregnant women. This immediately made Fred fall into deep thought. Why would someone specifically buy pregnant women? What did they want to do? Suddenly, a familiar and terrifying figure appeared in Fred's mind. Could someone be using black magic to create female ghosts? This made Fred panic. He hurriedly got up to find Bulan and told him about this matter. Bulan was speechless. He had finally found some time to rest, and now another matter came up. Bulan was about to refuse, but Joseph's carriage had already arrived downstairs. He immediately complained again. Wasn't it supposed to arrive in 2 days? But complaining aside, he still had to greet his master. Upon meeting, Joseph immediately sensed that Fred had something on his mind, so he let several people go inside for a detailed discussion. The mayor then warmly welcomed them inside, but Jorge didn't give him any pleasant looks because he knew his mayoral position wouldn't last long. Sure enough, once inside, Joseph told the mayor he didn't need to come tomorrow. Everyone present was shocked to hear this, but the mayor couldn't disobey his master's words and could only leave dejectedly. Joseph didn't care and directly told Fred to tell him, the new mayor, whatever was on his mind. So Fred told him about everything that had happened recently, as well as their plan to find Black Bear. After listening, Joseph told Fred to go and come back quickly because there was another matter for him to handle. This matter was very important concerning the Black Mage. So Fred hurriedly had Otter bring the banner and come with him to the deepest part of the back alley. The alleys here were the most chaotic, and there were all sorts of vicious people. Fred's purpose in coming here was to find the butcher Black Bear. But the people inside made Fred wait a while. Fred didn't mind since he had time anyway, so he decided to wait. But he waited until evening before the people inside opened the door to let Fred in. But Fred chose to ignore them. After all, knights had their pride. Seeing Fred wouldn't come in, the man prepared to close the door. Hearing about closing the door, Fred's expression darkened and he threatened, "If you dare close that door, there will be several more corpses today." Upon hearing this, the man froze for a moment. He was about to say something, but Fred directly unfurled the banner and said in a deep voice, "I will exercise my rights under the guarantee of my honor. Tell Black Bear to come out and greet me personally." Upon hearing this, the man completely panicked, because he had heard that if the banner was planted in the ground, terrible things would happen. After receiving Fred's threat, Black Bear lost his previous arrogance and said he would fully cooperate with Lord Joseph. So Fred hurriedly returned to the mayor's office to tell Joseph this news. Joseph smiled faintly. Very satisfied with Fred's behavior, since it was already settled, Joseph arranged his task. That was to establish a search team to fully search for the Black Mage. For this, he planned to give the task to Gregory. After listening, Gregory solemnly said he would definitely complete the mission and live up to expectations. Then he began selecting teammates. He chose Saccade, who was skilled in tracking, and the rising star, Fred. A few days later, following Saccade's tracking, they arrived at Baron Utman's territory. Only the weather here seemed somewhat strange, with torrential rain for several consecutive days. They discussed and decided to set off again the next day. The next day the rain indeed stopped, but thick fog rose up. Everything revealed an eerie atmosphere. Fred didn't mind, thinking this was a normal phenomenon. Then they discussed and decided to find an inn to stay at. The boss was very puzzled. It was still so early, yet someone wanted to check in at this time. Gregory explained the situation. During the explanation, a cute little girl poked her head out and stared intently at Fred. Fred waved at her in a friendly manner. Seeing this, the little girl immediately blushed. Suddenly, the Sword Soul's voice rang in Fred's mind. "Fred, there's something strange here. I'll lend you my world. Take a look at that little girl." Fred looked closely. He saw a black aura emanating from the necklace on the girl's chest. The black aura transformed into a ghostly hand wrapped around the girl's neck. This was a curse. Then Fred followed the aura to its end. The end of the black aura was actually a church. Seeing this, Fred didn't hesitate. He walked straight in boldly. After searching around, everything in the church looked quite normal, with nothing unusual. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind. To avoid alerting anyone and arousing suspicion, Fred immediately crouched down, pretending to pray. The person was a priest from the church. Just as Fred was about to bow and pay respect, he noticed something was off. The pattern on the book the priest was holding was the same as the one on the little girl's necklace. This was too strange. This didn't seem like a normal church symbol. Fred forced himself to calm down. Now wasn't the time to panic. The urgent matter was to find Sir Gregory and report. So after praying, Fred left the church without showing any emotion. But after coming out, Fred didn't immediately go find Gregory. Instead, he found a nearby old man doing farm work and asked if anything strange had happened recently. Originally, the old man didn't think there was anything wrong, but hearing Fred say this, the old man said, "Indeed, it feels a bit off. Recently, children have been dying mysteriously, like some infectious disease." After getting the answer, Fred bowed in gratitude and hurriedly left because he knew this wasn't some simple infectious disease, but a curse. On the road, the sword soul spoke. "This black mage should be very strong. Only highly priests can see through it, but there's no evidence, so taking rash measures would be risky." Just then, a cloaked figure in the distance caught Fred's attention. He was holding the same pattern necklace Fred had seen in the church, giving the necklaces to children, and his behavior was suspicious. After giving the necklaces to the children, he left. So, to investigate further, Fred quietly followed, but he always felt like the cloaked person was deliberately luring him out of the village. While Fred was thinking, the cloaked person flashed and appeared right in front of Fred. Fred immediately drew his sword to face the enemy, but the cloaked person's strength was great, and with just one strike, Fred was knocked back. The knockback. Fred only felt his arm going numb from the shock. Sensing the opponent's strength, he immediately activated his aura. The moment after the cloaked person attacked, Fred quickly moved his body, then thrust with his sword. But the cloaked person was too strong and dodged the attack with a simple lean backward and quickly counter-attacked. When the sword fell, the collision of their two auras produced a huge explosion. When the smoke cleared, Fred was kneeling on the ground, while the cloaked person only had their cloak damaged, suffering no injury at all. Seeing her aura, Fred was stunned for a moment because her aura seemed somewhat different. The sword soul then explained, "This is sacred power. She's a paladin. Paladins have one weakness. They suppress people first, then communicate." Although Fred also thought about fighting back, but the opponent was too strong, and after just a few rounds, he was pinned to the ground with no power to resist. Outmatched in skill, Fred could only surrender. Then he confessed everything. "I come from Dia. I came here to investigate some matters." Learning he wasn't an enemy, the woman followed Fred back to the inn and introduced herself. "I am Justia, sent by the Northern Grand Diocese." Gregory also returned the courtesy, showing respect. Then everyone began exchanging information. Just said, "I believe that church is the main body of the curse." Gregory was stunned after hearing this, thinking, a paladin who follows the church actually thinks the church is the culprit. It seems the situation is more serious than imagined. "The development has exceeded my authority." Justia saw Gregory's concerns and told Gregory and the others they didn't need to interfere in this matter. Gregory and the others were also troubled, but faced with authority limitations, they had no choice. Only Justia could handle it alone. After some time, the sky gradually darkened. At this moment, Fred was aimlessly looking outside. Due to authority issues, their investigation had to stop, and they would leave soon. Seeing Fred was about to leave, the little girl became sad. She begged Fred to stay a few more days. Fred thought for a while and finally softened, agreeing. The little girl was very happy. She even gave Fred a flower ring she had woven as a gift. But right after giving the ring, she was urged by the boss to go to bed. After confirming Fred wouldn't leave tomorrow, she turned and went upstairs. But after just 2 steps, she stopped. Then she began trembling all over. Finally, her eyes rolled back, and she fell straight to the ground. Fred was shocked and immediately used his aura to check the specific situation. Then he saw the curse had been activated. At the same time, Gregory and the other two heard the commotion and hurried over. Seeing this scene, everyone couldn't help but worry. Miss Josiah's expression turned cold. She turned around, ready to go to the church alone. Gregory's face looked grim. He wanted to go too, but rules were rules. This made Fred very angry. Fred said, "Since you won't go, then I'll go myself." But he was stopped by Gregory. Gregory said, "Listen well, Rising Star. A knight's sword is heavy. Our swords need reason and responsibility, so we just need to find a reason." Hearing this, Fred was somewhat confused, not understanding what Gregory meant. Meanwhile, Josiah found the source of the dark aura. Sure enough, it was the church. Then she pushed open the door and walked in. The priest smiled eerily. "You came quite quickly, but why are you alone? Without everyone present, we can't pray properly." The priest's words were cryptic, and Justia didn't quite understand. But the next second she knew, because a group of female ghosts suddenly burst out from outside the door, all shouting, "Where is my child?" The scene was terrifying. Justia didn't hesitate and immediately mobilized her sacred power with full force. A beam of light shot up to the sky. This was the sacred skill solemn exorcism. All evil spirits hit would be suppressed. However, this skill had a drawback. It consumed lifespan. The priest, seeing the time was right, decisively summoned a pitch-black treasure sword. As they say, strike while the iron is hot. Seeing the priest about to attack with his sword, Justinian knew she couldn't escape. So she decisively burned her remaining lifespan, preparing to unleash her strongest attack. At this critical moment, a burning wooden chair flew from a distance. This was thrown by Fred and the others. The priest smiled faintly. With one sword strike, he shattered the wooden chair into pieces. Although the wooden chair became fragments, it gave Fred a chance to get close. Fred suppressed the priest with one sword strike. However, rather than saying Fred suppressed the priest, it was more accurate to say the priest was stunned, seeing the sword soul within Fred. During this time, Gregory asked what was happening. Justia hurriedly told him the root of everything was the bell tower outside. They had to hurry. Gregory also knew they had to hurry, but Sir Cade couldn't use aura. It seemed they had to let Fred free his hands first. After saying this, Gregory suddenly gathered his strength, and his eyes also burst with aura. He bear hugged the priest away from the battle and told Fred to quickly go clean up whatever was in the bell tower. Fred immediately set off upon receiving the order, but the priest used black magic. He controlled the female ghost army to surge toward Fred again. Fred had difficulty moving through the ghost horde. Fortunately, just yet enchanted Cad's arrows. This allowed Fred to escape the predicament. Thus, Fred had a clear path all the way. Meanwhile, Sir Gregory had successfully completely suppressed the priest. This priest seemed strong, but in Gregory's hands, he was just a rookie. Even after being defeated, the priest kept taunting with his words, so Gregory cut off his head, making him shut up forever. The female ghost outside also stopped moving. Because of this, just as Gregory was about to take a sip of water to relax, unexpectedly, the priest's severed head actually spoke, and flames also gushed out from the original body's severed parts. Jessia thought this was bad, because she recognized this monster as the Headless Knight, Dolahan. On the other side, Fred finally reached the bell tower's location, but the dense runes above gave Fred a headache. Fortunately, he had the Sword Soul's guidance. Just as he was about to attack, the ground suddenly cracked and Fred's spellcasting was interrupted. Then Fred fell straight down. After landing, Fred saw the church before him had become ruins. He was somewhat bewildered. Before he could think much, the Headless Knight walked out from behind. Fred was startled and immediately raised his sword, asking where the others were. The Headless Knight smiled faintly. He said, Their aura is useless to me, so I let them sleep for a while. What I want is only this." And with that, he lifted up what was from the bell tower. Fred, seeing the source of the curse before him, raised his sword to strike. But this mindless attack was useless against the Headless Knight. In just an instant, offense and defense switched. Only the effects were different. The Headless Knight could easily block attacks, but Fred couldn't defend against the Headless Knight's attacks. Fortunately, Fred had the elf's blessing. Otherwise, he couldn't have blocked at all. Fred also seized this opportunity to strike with his sword, although he successfully split the Headless Knight in two. But the Headless Knight was an undead creature. A mere slash had no effect at all. Soon, Fred was suppressed again. The Sword Soul finally couldn't stand it anymore. The Sword Soul said, "Young man, I allow you to connect to my world." As soon as the words fell, Fred's aura suddenly turned grey. The Headless Knight was shocked by this scene, but before he could react, Fred flashed to his front and grey aura swirled around them. But as the saying goes, the bigger the special effects, the lower the damage, so the recent attack only scratched the Headless Knight's hand. After his hand was scratched, the Headless Knight finally got angry. Then he activated his complete form. Seeing this, Fred was stunned. What was this thing? In the 1 second he was stunned, the Headless Knight disappeared. When Fred came to his senses, the Headless Knight was already behind him. The Headless Knight struck with his sword. Fred was heavily knocked away, then fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Next, the Headless Knight prepared to immediately deliver the finishing blow, just as he was about to stab the sword into Fred's body. Fred suddenly grabbed the long sword with his hand. His hand was also emanating silver light. It turned out the Sword Soul had taken control of the unconscious Fred, helping him block this strike. Then, huge light exploded from Fred's body. Unlike before, this time the Headless Knight was beaten and howling. Although the Sword Soul had lost his memory, he was also a knight, one who existed to protect. Then it was time for the second round. The Headless Knight couldn't help but be frightened by this terrifying aura, especially Fred's lightning-fast attacks. The Headless Knight was beaten with no power to fight back. The Headless Knight, pinned to the ground, wanted to say something, but was directly crushed by the Sword Soul. However, the Headless Knight was an undead creature after all, and soon restored his body. But so, what if he restored his body? Since he could be killed once, he could be killed a second time. So what followed was the Sword Soul's one-sided crushing of the Headless Knight. Although the Headless Knight couldn't feel pain, every attack from this man before him was extremely fierce. Each attack caused damage to his soul. Finally, even his heart was torn open. Only then did they discover this cunning fellow had actually hidden the curse's source in his heart. Seeing this, the Sword Soul crushed it with one palm. Thus, the trapped soul successfully returned to their bodies. But how to kill this guy? For this, the Sword Soul had a good idea. That was to chop all his limbs to pieces. The Headless Knight still wanted to escape, but was cut down by another sword that severed both his legs. Just as the Sword Soul's about to cut off his last arm, the Headless Knight finally couldn't take it anymore and began shouting loudly, "Save me, Lord Lamute." As soon as the words fell, pitch-black tentacles appeared out of nowhere. But the tentacles weren't there to save him, but to kill him and silence him. Hearing this name, the Sword Soul only felt it was somewhat familiar. But now wasn't the time to think about this because Fred's body couldn't hold on anymore. With that, Fred fell straight down. At the same time, in Utman's territory, a woman sat calmly on a throne. Below the throne were bloody, severed heads and countless headless knights. That's right. This woman was Lamute mentioned by the Headless Knight. 3 days later, Fred painfully crawled up from bed. He had been unconscious for 3 whole days. Although his body was in pain, at least no one was injured. The Sword Soul said it should be because Justia finally released a barrier which prevented everyone from getting hurt. She was indeed very capable. After saying this, Fred was stunned for a moment. The Sword Soul was actually praising someone. But the next second, he seemed to think of something else. That was to thank Sword Soul on behalf of everyone for his help. The Sword Soul didn't speak, and the air fell into brief awkwardness. Just then, the Sword Soul's voice slowly came. "H, you worked hard too." Fred smiled faintly. These words really touched his heart. The next day, Fred came to the village to find Justia to discuss something. The paladin told him to wait a moment. After some time, the paladin came out to notify Fred he could go in. But as soon as Fred walked into the church, he was stunned because the entire church was full of corpses. These corpses were all the controlled female ghosts. Among them was Anna, who had once taken care of him. Only now she had become a corpse. Fred said regretfully, "May you live a happier life in your next life." After some time at the Paladin station camp, Josiah wanted to ask what exactly happened that day, so she found Fred to talk. Fred was afraid of exposing the Sword Soul's matter, so his words were half true and half false. He said, "Oh, right, there seemed to be another name, something like Lama." Hearing these words, Justia was stunned and said, "Lama Sut." Fred said, "Right, that's the name." After getting a definitive answer, Justia turned and left the tent, and her expression became extremely terrifying. Meanwhile, in Dia's mayor's office, Joseph was having a detailed discussion with an elderly man. The old man was called Ramon, a knight of the former head of house and also the teacher of Yoerga and other older generation knights. He possessed countless honors, and Joseph had to treat him with courtesy. But Ramon didn't put on airs at all, instead calling himself the lowest person. He came this time only to see Fred, who had been in the spotlight recently. He said, "Before this I met the head of house because I still have the last ducat in my hand. I wanted to get some understanding, but Sturma's attendants are all blockheads. So are the attendants. You've trained the same." Hearing this, Joseph was shocked. Others might not know what a ducat was, but he definitely knew a ducat was a symbol of honor. Seeing Joseph stunned, Jorger explained, "Fred is at least stronger than those guys. He's just a bit stubborn." Raoni said, "Hearing you say that, it sounds pretty good. As long as he's not like that Sovereign who relies on having backing and acts arrogantly." Before he finished speaking, Joseph said, "Fred has no parents, so he wouldn't be like that. He grew up in the back alley with no one to rely on. He reached his position entirely through his own personal ability." As for why Joseph said this, he had a selfish motive. He wanted to evoke empathy from this legendary figure. Joseph said, "Lord Raoni, so I don't want you to give him the ducat, but I hope you can teach him a move." Raoni slowly opened his eyes and said, "Since it's the young master's request, then I'll take a good look." The next day, at the mayor's office, Joseph first praised the three for completing their mission well, but the next second his tone changed sharply. "But drawing the sword of Bayote on another lord's land is unforgivable." Gregory immediately expressed his willingness to accept punishment. Round behind couldn't help but laugh. Fred glanced back, but didn't pay much attention. Joseph continued, "Although I understand your intentions were good, this time you've really caused big trouble and might trigger a war." As soon as he finished speaking, Ramon interrupted. "You should have withdrawn. Wasn't there a paladin there? Normally you should have left the matter to that person." As soon as this was said, Fred's anger immediately flared up. Fred said, "If we hadn't stepped in, the children would have died." Everyone was completely unexpected that Fred would actually argue back. Ramon was equally surprised, so he unconsciously took another look at Fred. It was this look that completely changed his opinion. He originally thought Fred was just a brat, but this expression was that of a complete beast. Fred continued. Sir Gregory fought with all his might for the children, and the paladin also gave assurance. Rather than reprimand, they should be praised. Also, Fred wanted to say more, but was interrupted by Joseph's shout, "Enough, don't challenge my patience anymore." Seeing Joseph was angry, Fred hurriedly apologized. Joseph continued, "I believe in Sir Gregory's character, but rules are rules. So I announce that Knight Gregory will be suspended indefinitely. Knight Cade will also receive the same punishment. Finally, Attendant Fred, I also punish you with indefinite reflection, and don't appear before me until I summon you." At these words, Fred was completely stunned, but could only reluctantly accept. However, Joseph's disappointed look made Fred's mood very complicated. Just then, Ramon stopped Fred, who was feeling depressed. Out of politeness, Fred still bowed, then said, "I am Fred of Dia. May I know your distinguished name?" Fred appeared polite on the surface, but his eyes were glaring fiercely at Raone. Ramon couldn't help but shiver. Then he grinned and unfolded the banner covered with pattern, saying, "Unfortunately, I can't tell you my name now. After all, I walk the path of the lowest and haven't fulfilled all my obligations yet." At these words, Fred was stunned. The word lowest deeply touched his heart. Time came to evening, and familiar sounds rang from the blacksmith shop. Inside, Fred was telling the blacksmith about Raone's matter. The blacksmith just gave perfunctory responses because he was concentrating on repairing the sword. After some time, a brand new treasure sword was forged. So Fred prepared to leave with satisfaction and promised to bring good wine and meat next time to thank him. After saying this, Fred turned and left. The back alley at night was very quiet and dark. Someone was following Fred behind. Although he tried his best to hide his presence, he was still detected by Fred. With just one turn, Fred disappeared and had circled behind. Fred said, "Why are you following me?" Raone said, "What are you talking about? I'm just walking my own path." Fred said, "Stop lying. I know. You've been tracking me, and from our first meeting, you've been provoking me. If you have any dissatisfaction with me, you can tell me directly. No need to beat around the bush." Ramon smiled faintly and said, "Rather than words, I prefer to speak with swords."